Tonight's story takes us back to the late Victorian era. A time of gaslit streets, steamships crossing vast oceans, and a world that was becoming connected in ways it never had been before. It's the story of a man who used that newly connected world to his advantage, moving from country to country, assuming new names, and leaving a trail of secrets behind him. Frederick Bailey Deeming was, by all appearances, a man of charm and confidence. He could walk into a room and make himself known, sometimes a little too known. He was loud, attention-seeking, and had a way of inserting himself into the lives of those around him, particularly women, with an almost theatrical flair. He drifted across continents, from England to Australia, and many places in between, always reinventing himself, always spinning a new tale about who he was. But beneath that restless, larger-than-life exterior, Deeming was hiding something dark. And when the truth finally began to surface in the autumn of the Southern Hemisphere, in a quiet suburb of Melbourne in 1892, it sent shockwaves through the newspapers of the world. The story moved so quickly, in fact, that the entire affair, from first discovery to its grim conclusion, unfolded in a matter of weeks, gripping the public imagination on both sides of the globe. His name even became tangled with one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of the age, but we'll get to that. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's drift back to the fog and gaslight of the 1800s and follow the strange, winding journey of Frederick Bailey Deeming. Frederick Bailey Deeming came into the world on the 30th of July, 1853, in the small market town of Ashby-de-la-Zouch in Leicestershire, England. His father, Thomas, was a brazier, a tradesman who worked with brass, and his mother was Anne, whose maiden name was Bailey. It was an ordinary enough beginning, in an ordinary enough place, and nothing about the family would have marked them out as remarkable. But Frederick was a difficult child, restless and troublesome from an early age, and by the time he reached 16, he had had enough of small-town life and ran away to sea. Whatever he saw and did in those early years of wandering, they set him on a path he would follow for the rest of his days, a long, winding career of thieving, lying, and obtaining money under false pretenses. On the 20th of February, 1881, at the age of 27, he married a woman named Marie James at St. Paul's Church in Tranmere. Marie was a slater's daughter, just 1 year younger than Frederick, and the couple settled briefly in Birkenhead, in Cheshire, just across the Mersey from Liverpool. As it happened, Deeming's brother Alfred had also married into the James family, taking Marie's sister Martha as his wife, so the two families were bound closely together. Marie herself was described as a typical Welsh lass, and in 1882, the young couple made the decision to leave England and try their luck in Australia. Once there, they moved about a good deal, with Frederick chiefly finding work in Sydney, though he also spent time in Melbourne, where he was taken on by a plumbing and gas fitting importer by the name of John Danks. His employers thought well of him. They found him a capable and diligent worker, and trusted him enough to extend him £200 in credit, supposedly so he could set up a business of his own in Rockhampton, up in Queensland. The money, of course, was never repaid, and there is no sign that any such business was ever intended. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout Deeming's life. He had a knack for winning people's confidence, extracting what he could from them, and moving on before the consequences caught up with him. He also took work with a gasfitter in Sydney, and it was there that his dishonesty first brought him before the law. He was charged with stealing brass fittings from his employer, a charge he denied with great indignation, but the stolen goods were found at his home, and he was sentenced to 6 weeks' imprisonment. When the sentence was read out, Deeming put on a performance of his own. He pretended to faint in the dock. After his release, he carried on working in Sydney as a gasfitter, seemingly undeterred until December of 1887, when he was once again hauled before the courts, this time on a charge of fraudulent insolvency. He was let out on bail and promptly disappeared from New South Wales altogether. All the while, Frederick and Marie had been raising a family. Their first daughter, Bertha, was born around 1881, followed by a second daughter, Marie, sometimes called Mary, around 1884. A son, Sydney, arrived around 1886, and then came their youngest, a little girl named Layla. So by the late 1880s, Frederick Bailey Deeming was a husband and father of 4 young children, and also a man with a well-worn habit of deception, theft and vanishing when things grew inconvenient. And now, true to form, he had vanished once again. In 1888, word reached Deeming's brothers Alfred and Walter that Frederick and his family were on their way back to England, apparently in possession of a considerable fortune. How much truth there was in this is hard to say. With Deeming, claims of wealth were as common as they were unreliable. What is known is that around this time he was active in Cape Town, South Africa, during 1888 and into 1889, though whether Marie and the children were with him on these travels remains uncertain. His movements in this period are difficult to pin down with any precision, and it seems he passed back and forth between South Africa and England at least once. What is clear is that in 1889, he involved himself in a diamond mine swindle in the Transvaal, the sort of brazen confidence trick that suited his talents perfectly, preying on the appetite for quick riches that the South African diamond fields had stirred in so many. His voyage back to England aboard the steamship Yumna was long remembered by those who shared it with him, and not fondly. The captain and passengers alike recalled his showy display of jewelry and money, and his persistent and unwelcome attentions towards several of the women on board. It was typical Deeming. He simply could not help drawing attention to himself, even when discretion would have served him far better. By November of 1889, he had arrived at Hull, and he took lodgings in the nearby town of Beverley. Here he assumed a fresh identity, as he so often did, this time styling himself as Harry Lawson, a retired sheep farmer from Mount House Farm in Rockhampton, Queensland, a man of comfortable means living on £1,500 a year. It was a convincing enough story, at least for those who had no reason to doubt it, and before long he had caught the eye of Helen Matheson, the 21-year-old daughter of his landlady. He courted her with the same mix of confidence and generosity that marked all his dealings with women, and on the 18th of February, 1890, the two were married. The marriage was, of course, entirely bigamous. Marie and the 4 children were still very much alive and still very much his responsibility, though he showed precious little sign of feeling any. The honeymoon took the couple to the south of England, and for a brief time, Helen Matheson must have believed she had married a man of substance and standing. But about a month after the wedding, Deeming vanished, just as suddenly as he had appeared, taking with him the expensive gifts he had lavished upon her during their courtship. It was the same trick he had played before, and would play again: generosity as a tool, affection as a means to an end, and then silence. According to the writers Gervich and Ray, Marie and her extended family had by now caught wind of the bigamous marriage, though what Marie made of it, and what passed between her and Frederick on the subject, is not recorded. What is known is that after abandoning Matheson, Deeming went to see Marie and the children in Birkenhead. He gave her several £100, a significant sum, and told her he was bound for South America, promising that once he was settled, he would send for her and the children to join him. Whether Marie believed him by this point is anyone's guess, but the money at least must have been welcome, with 4 young mouths to feed. Before leaving the country, however, Deeming could not resist pulling one more scheme, this time swindling a jeweler's shop in Hull. And this time his luck did not hold. He was arrested upon arrival in Montevideo, extradited back to England, and charged with obtaining goods by false pretenses. He was sentenced to 9 months in prison, a spell behind bars that, for most men, might have prompted some reflection. But Frederick Bailey Deeming was not most men. In July of 1891, Deeming walked out of prison and made his way straight to the Liverpool area. He had not been a free man for long before he was up to his old ways, checking into a hotel in the quiet village of Rainhill under yet another assumed name, Albert Williams. A woman appeared at the hotel around this time, and she was almost certainly Marie, his wife. But Deeming told anyone who asked that she was merely his sister, paying a brief visit before traveling on to Port Said. He then took out a lease on a house called Dinham Villa, also in Rainhill, telling the landlord he was securing it on behalf of a military acquaintance, a certain Colonel Brooks, who would be taking up residence in due course. In truth, no Colonel Brooks existed. It was Deeming himself who moved in. Over the following days, a woman and several young children were spotted at the house, but once again Deeming had his story ready. They were his sister and her children, he explained, and they had since gone home. The neighbors had no particular reason to question this, and life in Rainhill carried on as before. But inside Denham Villa, something terrible was about to take place. On or around the 26th of July, 1891, though the exact date is uncertain, and it may have been as late as the 11th of August, Deeming took the lives of Marie and all 4 of their children. The details need not be dwelt upon, except to say that it was done with dreadful violence, and that afterwards he concealed their remains beneath the floor of the house. Shortly after, with a coolness that is hard to fathom, he complained to workmen that the drains at Denham Villa were faulty, and that the kitchen floor was in need of repair. He stood over the laborers as they worked, supervising every detail of the job, making sure the floor was laid just so. None of them had any idea what lay beneath it. What makes this still more chilling is that by the time these events unfolded, Deeming had already turned his attentions elsewhere. He had begun courting Emily Lydia Mather, a young woman from Rainhill, the daughter of a widowed shopkeeper and stationer by the name of Mrs. Dove Mather. Emily, by all accounts, was taken in by his charm, just as so many others had been before her. On the 22nd of September, 1891, barely 2 months after the horrors at Denham Villa, Deeming married Emily at St. Anne's Church in Rainhill. He gave his name as Albert Oliver Williams and claimed to be the son of a Colonel Albert William Williams, weaving yet another fiction around himself with practiced ease. Emily knew nothing of Marie, nothing of the children, and nothing of what lay beneath the floors of the house her new husband had so recently occupied. Meanwhile, Deeming kept up the deception with those who might have raised an alarm. He led his brothers and Marie's sister Martha to believe that Marie and the children were on holiday in Brighton, and when time passed and no word came, the family simply assumed they must have gone overseas again, not an unusual thing for people in that era of long sea voyages and slow communication. Deeming even visited Martha in Birkenhead on several occasions, looking her in the eye and assuring her that her sister and the little ones were doing well. The discovery of the truth was further delayed by the terms of the lease Deeming had signed on Denham Villa. Under the name Williams, he had stipulated that the house should not be sold or relet for 6 months, on account of the imminent arrival of Colonel Brooks, or alternatively, of William's sister. The lease also, crucially, gave him permission to resurface the concrete floor. And so Denham Villa sat quiet and undisturbed through the autumn and into winter, its secret held fast beneath the ground. In November of 1891, still calling himself Williams, Deeming and his new wife Emily set sail for Australia aboard the German steamship Kaiser Wilhelm II. It was a long voyage, and during the weeks at sea, Emily talked freely with her fellow passengers about her family back in Rainhill, her mother, the shop, the life she had left behind. She had no reason to guard her words, and no idea that these casual conversations would one day become evidence in a criminal investigation. Deeming, too, made an impression on the other passengers, as he always did. He held court, drew attention, and generally conducted himself in a manner that people remembered, though not always with affection. When police later tracked down and interviewed those who had shared the voyage, many said plainly that they had detested Williams, but curiously, all of them agreed that he had treated his wife with apparent love and tenderness throughout the journey. The couple arrived in Melbourne on the 15th of December, 1891, in the heat of an Australian summer. Deeming rented a house on Andrew Street in Windsor, a modest suburb south of the city centre, paying a month's rent in advance and giving his name this time as Mr. Droon. The landlord was a local butcher named John Stamford, who had been happy enough to let the place to a man who carried himself with such an air of respectability. At first, Stamford hadn't even asked the man's name. His manner alone had been recommendation enough. For a short while the couple settled into the house, and nothing about them would have struck the neighbors as out of the ordinary. But as later emerged during the inquest into Emily's death, early in 1892, a man answering Deeming's description, now staying at the Cathedral Hotel on Swanston Street under the name Mr. Duncan, had been seen auctioning off various household goods in the city, items that may well have been wedding presents. It was the sort of thing Deeming did almost by instinct, turning whatever came to hand into ready money. Then on the 24th of December, or perhaps in the early hours of Christmas Day, 1891, Deeming turned on Emily in the house on Andrew Street and ended her life. He buried her beneath the hearthstone of one of the bedrooms, covering the body with cement, and left the property very soon after. Several days later, he sat down and wrote a warm and affectionate letter to Emily's mother back in Rainhill, signing it as Albert Williams, full of pleasantries, giving not the slightest hint of what had happened. Mrs. Dove Mather, reading that letter in her shop in Rainhill, would have had no cause to worry about her daughter at all. And in a detail that speaks volumes about the kind of man Deeming was, either just before or just after these events, he had called upon Holt's matrimonial agency in Melbourne, using the name Duncan, and expressed his desire to be introduced to a young lady with a view to marriage. He also took the opportunity to swindle a Melbourne jeweler. The house on Andrew Street sat still and silent, with its terrible secret beneath the hearthstone, and Frederick Bailey Deeming, under one name or another, was already moving on. On the 22nd of September, 1891, barely 2 months after the horrors at Dinham Villa, Deeming married Emily at St. Anne's Church in Rainhill. He gave his name as Albert Oliver Williams, and claimed to be the son of a Colonel Albert William Williams, weaving yet another fiction around himself with practiced ease. Emily knew nothing of Marie, nothing of the children, and nothing of what lay beneath the floors of the house her new husband had so recently occupied. Meanwhile, Deeming kept up the deception with those who might have raised an alarm. He led his brothers and Marie's sister Martha to believe that Marie and the children were on holiday in Brighton, and when time passed and no word came, the family simply assumed they must have gone overseas again, not an unusual thing for people in that era of long sea voyages and slow communication. Deeming even visited Martha in Birkenhead on several occasions, looking her in the eye and assuring her that her sister and the little ones were doing well. The discovery of the truth was further delayed by the terms of the lease Deeming had signed on Dinham Villa. Under the name Williams, he had stipulated that the house should not be sold or relet for 6 months, on account of the imminent arrival of Colonel Brooks, or alternatively, of William's sister. The lease also, crucially, gave him permission to resurface the concrete floor. It was the 3rd of March, 1892, when someone finally came looking at the house on Andrew Street. A prospective tenant, viewing the property with an eye to renting it, noticed a foul and disagreeable smell coming from the second bedroom. The owner and the estate agent returned to investigate, and when they raised the hearthstone, the stench that rose from beneath was so powerful that they could scarcely draw breath. The police were called at once, and Emily Mather's body was found where Deeming had placed it, buried under the floor and covered in cement. A post-mortem examination was carried out the following day, on the 4th of March. The discovery set off a storm of publicity, not just in Melbourne but far beyond. And it did not take long, no more than 2 days, in fact, for the press to draw a connection that would cling to Deeming's name for generations. On the 5th of March, the Age newspaper in Melbourne published an article linking the Windsor murder to the infamous Whitechapel killings attributed to Jack the Ripper, those terrible events in London's East End that had gripped and horrified the world between August and November of 1888. The newspaper pointed to the state of the body, the methodical way the cement had been laid, the calculated taking of a house for the purpose, and the painstaking effort to cover all traces of the crime, and suggested that such cold-blooded cunning and malice could scarcely be the work of a sane mind. The comparison struck a nerve with the public. As Australians tried to make sense of the savagery that had taken place in the quiet suburb of Windsor, speculation in the press grew louder and more insistent, with one paper after another raising the possibility that the man responsible might also be the phantom who had haunted the alleyways of Whitechapel. The theory spread well beyond Australia. On the 17th of March, the New York Times carried the story under a set of arresting headlines: "Perhaps Jack the Ripper, the startling discovery made in Liverpool, a man arrested in Australia." What fed the speculation was the tantalizing possibility that Deeming could have been in England at the time of the Whitechapel murders, and that his habit of moving under assumed names might have allowed him to slip through the net that police had cast across the East End. By 1912, a waxworks exhibition at Cratemere's in Melbourne showed Deeming in the act of burying Mather, with a caption noting that he was suspected of being identical with Jack the Ripper. a reflection, most likely, of what a great many ordinary people had already come to believe. The Metropolitan Police in London, however, took a different view. As early as 1892, they officially dismissed Deeming as a Whitechapel suspect, on the grounds that they had evidence placing him either in prison or in South Africa during the period of the killings. And yet the idea has refused to die. More than a century later, a former Metropolitan Police detective named Robin Napper, working alongside a team of forensic researchers, concluded that the weight of evidence actually pointed toward Deeming as the Ripper. In a documentary broadcast on the Discovery Channel in 2011, Napper argued that the Crime Museum's long-standing display of a copy of Deeming's death mask, labeled as that of Jack the Ripper, was itself proof that the police had always quietly regarded him as a strong suspect, whatever their official position might have been. Whether the connection holds any real water is still argued over to this day, and the truth of it may never be known for certain. But the mere whiff of an association with those fog-bound horrors in Whitechapel was enough to lift Deeming's name out of the ranks of ordinary criminals and fix it permanently in the public imagination, tangled up with perhaps the greatest unsolved mystery in the history of crime. While the press was busy drawing comparisons to Jack the Ripper, the police in Melbourne had been quietly and methodically going about their work. From the clues left behind at the vacant house on Andrew Street, and from the accounts of local tradespeople who had dealt with the mysterious Mr. Williams, two Victoria police sergeants, William Considine and Henry Causey, began to assemble a picture of the man they were looking for. The butcher Stamford and his letting agent could describe the tenant. A local laundress had washed his linen. An ironmonger recalled selling him cement. Several carriers remembered moving goods to and from the property. Each of these ordinary people held a small piece of the puzzle, and Considine and Causey fitted them together with care. They traced the recently arrived Mr. Williams to the steamship Kaiser Wilhelm II, and from there they were able to track down and interview the passengers who had shared the long voyage from England. The descriptions they gave all matched. This was the same man, no question of it, and they confirmed his apparently loving treatment of the woman traveling with him as his wife. Most valuably of all, the passengers recalled Emily's mentions of her family in Rainhill, her mother and the stationery shop, details that gave the investigators concrete leads to follow and a firm connection between the mysterious Mr. Williams and a real place, with real people who might know more. A detailed physical description of the wanted man was drawn up and circulated to police forces across the Australian colonies. But at this stage, his true name remained a mystery. In the meantime, Deeming had already put hundreds of miles between himself and the house on Andrew Street. On or about the 12th of January, 1892, well before the body had been found, he had made his way to Sydney, now going by the title of Baron Swanston. It was a grand name, and he carried it with the brazenness that came naturally to him. During the journey and after his arrival in Sydney, he met a woman by the name of Kate Rouncefell, and set about courting her with the urgency and intensity that marked all his romantic pursuits. He told Rouncefell that if she consented to become his wife, she would never have cause to regret it, and would always congratulate herself on having entered into matrimony with him. It was quite a promise, coming from a man who had buried 2 wives in the space of 5 months. After a brief and breathless courtship, during which Deeming presented Rouncefell with several pieces of jewelry, items that would later be traced back to a Melbourne jeweler he had swindled, she agreed to marry him. She also agreed to follow him to Western Australia, and the two parted for the time being, with Deeming heading west armed with forged letters of recommendation, which he used to secure himself a position at a gold mine in the remote settlement of Southern Cross. On the 22nd of January, 1892, Baron Swanston boarded a ship bound for Fremantle, and once again made himself the center of attention on the voyage, boasting freely of his wealth and his standing in society. He also turned his attentions to a young woman named Miss Maud Beach, who was traveling under the protection of her uncle and aunt, a Mr. and Mrs. Wakely. But this time his charm fell flat. Mr. Wakely sized him up and told him in plain terms that he did not believe a word of his stories, and that he was not in the habit of allowing men of his sort anywhere near his family. It was one of the few occasions on record where someone saw straight through Deeming and told him so to his face. Undiscouraged, Deeming settled into his new position at Southern Cross and turned his energies back to Rouncewell, bombarding her with letters urging her to join him without delay. On the 8th of February he wrote to her, "Don't keep me waiting, dear. If you love me half as much as I love you, you would not keep me waiting a day." But the net was tightening. Victoria police had been in contact with their counterparts in Western Australia by telegraph, and the description of the man wanted in connection with the Windsor murder had reached the far side of the continent. On the 12th of March, 1892, police arrived at Southern Cross and placed Deeming under arrest. He denied at first that he was the man they were looking for, but then let slip a curious remark, "I think I know the party who has been murdered. I don't believe anyone would have the heart to murder a girl like that." It was the kind of thing an innocent man would not have said, and it was noted carefully. Found among his possessions at the time of his arrest were a number of items that had belonged to Emily Mather, including her prayer book, quiet, personal things that tied him directly to the dead woman in Windsor. Back in England, the news of Emily's fate reached Rainhill before any official word could be sent. An English journalist working for the Melbourne Argus tracked down Mrs. Dove Mather at her home and was the first to tell her what had become of her daughter. Mrs. Mather had heard nothing, no rumor, no telegram, nothing at all about any trouble in Melbourne. When the journalist broke the news, she collapsed in a faint. The account was published in the Argus on the 14th of March, 1892, and was read with sorrow on both sides of the world. In the wake of all that had come to light, investigators in England now turned their attention to Dinham Villa in Rainhill, the house Deeming had leased under the name Williams the previous summer. What they found beneath the floor confirmed the worst fears of everyone involved, the remains of Marie Deeming and all 4 of the children, buried where they had lain undiscovered for months. An inquest was held at Rainhill on the 18th of March, at which Deeming's brothers came forward to identify Marie and to give what accounts they could of Frederick's movements and behavior. At roughly the same time that Deeming was being escorted back across Australia toward Melbourne, the news of the Rainhill discoveries arrived in the Australian press, and for the first time, the full and dreadful scope of his crimes was laid bare for all to see. He was not merely a man who had done away with one wife in a Melbourne suburb. He was a man who had destroyed an entire family, his own family, and then carried on as though nothing had happened, courting and marrying again within weeks. In Melbourne, a family friend of the Mathers, a man named Edward Thunderbolt, who held the rather memorable official title of Inspector of Public Nuisances, took it upon himself to honor Emily's memory. He organized a public subscription, and with the funds raised, erected a monument to her at the Melbourne General Cemetery, where it can still be seen to this day. A small, solid marker of a life cut short by a man who left wreckage wherever he went. As Deeming was transported back across the vast distances of Western Australia toward Melbourne, word of his capture and the nature of his crimes traveled ahead of him. Furious crowds turned out at the stops along the way, first on the journey to Perth and again at Albany, people who had read the newspaper reports and come to see the man for themselves and to make their feelings known. Public anger was fierce, and it is no small thing that Deeming arrived in Melbourne in one piece. His trial opened at the Melbourne Supreme Court on the 25th of April, 1892. The prosecution was led by Robert Walsh, Queen's Counsel, who laid out the evidence against Deeming with methodical precision. The house on Andrew Street, the body beneath the hearthstone, the cement, the false names, the belongings found in his possession at Southern Cross, and the testimony of passengers, tradespeople, and neighbors who had encountered the man calling himself Williams. Deeming's defense was in the hands of Alfred Deakin, a barrister of considerable talent and reputation, who would in later years go on to serve as Prime Minister of Australia. Deakin's strategy rested on a plea of insanity, the argument that Deeming's actions were not those of a rational mind, but of a man in the grip of madness. The defense also challenged the fairness of the proceedings, pointing to the enormous volume of newspaper coverage that had preceded the trial and questioning whether any jury could have remained untouched by it. It was a fair point in its way. Deeming's name and face had been in the papers for weeks, and the public had already formed its opinions long before the first witness was called. Deeming himself seemed at times to be playing along with the insanity defense, making a number of dramatic and peculiar claims from the dock. He said he had contracted syphilis while in London, and that the spirit of his dead mother had appeared to him, urging him toward the acts he had committed. Whether he believed any of this, or whether it was simply another performance from a man who had spent his whole life performing, is impossible to say. Before the jury retired to weigh their verdict, Deeming rose and delivered a speech on his own behalf, lengthy, rambling, and full of self-justification, touching on grievances real and imagined, and circling always back to himself. He repeated the story he had given the police after his arrest, that Emily had not been harmed at all, that she had simply run off with another man, and declared with apparent conviction, "That is my one comfort, knowing that she is not dead." It was a strange and hollow thing to say, given the evidence that had been presented, and the jury was not swayed by any of it. They found him guilty as charged. In the days that followed the verdict, while the legal formalities ground on, Deeming passed the time in his cell in ways that were oddly industrious. He set about writing his autobiography, the full account, as he wished it told, of his life and travels, and the circumstances that had brought him to this end. He also composed poetry, some of it darkly self-aware, including the lines, "The jury listened well to the yarn I had to tell, but they sent me straight to hell." He spent time in the company of Church of England clergymen who visited him in prison, and to whom he is said to have made some manner of confession, though the precise nature of what he told them was never made fully public. The sentence of the court was formally confirmed by the Executive Council on the 9th of May, 1892. 10 days later, on the 19th of May, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council refused Deeming leave to appeal, closing the last door available to him. On the morning of the 23rd of May, 1892, at 1 minute past 10 o'clock, Frederick Bailey Deeming was led to the gallows at the old Melbourne jail and hanged. He weighed 143 pounds, 14 pounds lighter than the day he had entered the prison, the weeks of confinement having worn him down in body, if not, it seems, in spirit. The autobiography he had labored over in his cell was collected and destroyed, and whatever version of events he had set down in his own hand was lost. No one outside those prison walls would ever read his final account of himself. 3 casts were made of his face after death, what are known as death masks. One remains on display at the old Melbourne jail, the very place where he met his end. Another is held in the collection of the State Library of Victoria, alongside a cast of his right hand, photographs, books, newspaper clippings, and letters connected to the case. The third found its way to London, to the Crime Museum at New Scotland Yard, where for many years it was displayed with a label that identified it, not as Frederick Bailey Deeming, but as Jack the Ripper. Whether that label reflected a genuine belief within the Metropolitan Police, or simply the lingering power of a rumor that had taken on a life of its own, is a question that has never been settled to everyone's satisfaction. What can be said with certainty is this: Frederick Bailey Deeming was a man who left a trail of suffering behind him wherever he went, who lied as easily as he breathed, and who destroyed the lives of those who trusted him most. He crossed oceans, assumed new names, and reinvented himself again and again, but in the end, the ordinary decency of ordinary people, tradesmen, passengers, neighbors, police sergeants doing their jobs, was enough to bring him to account. His story faded from the front pages soon enough, as stories do, but it never quite disappeared, kept alive by the whispered question that has followed his name for more than 130 years. Was Frederick Bailey Deeming truly Jack the Ripper? The answer in all likelihood is no. But the question itself has proved immortal, and it is the reason we are still speaking his name tonight. And with that, the strange wanderings of Frederick Bailey Deeming come to their end.